Let's talk about Paulo Costa's pullout game. It has been announced that Paulo Costa versus Robert Whittaker is officially on again, which is funny as this is the third time at making this fight, and fans are still not convinced that this fight is actually happening. As we know, Paulo Costa has an infamous history of letting down his fans and pulling out of seemingly every fight he has been given. So in today's video, let's cover chronologically the turbulent fight promises of Paulo Costa's career and why he's pulled out of almost every single fight that he has planned for and why he has the reputation of being the pullout merchant. So our story starts right here. Paulo Costa coming into this fight and attempt at the belt was an absolute wrecking ball. Young, undefeated, and in this run beat the bricks off a post-USADA Johnny Hendricks, punished Uriah Hall, and went to war with Yoel Romero. But all that came crashing down with a couple glasses of wine and a prime Israel Adesanya that took him down with a beautiful left hook to the temple. And since then, the allure of Paulo Costa as a young, scary contender practically diminished, though the silver lining is Paulo Costa became really funny on Twitter at least. But what wasn't funny was how many times Paulo Costa kept pulling out of fights. Let's start at the first attempt at fighting Robert Whittaker. After the Izzy fight in the next year, Paulo Costa was supposed to face Robert Whittaker in a fight night back in April 16, 2021, but Paulo Costa ended up pulling out apparently due to a very bad flu a month before the fight. Pretty unfortunate for Robert Whittaker due to the short notice, but he was able to still get an opponent and fight Kelvin Gastelum in a very fun fight and win in a very underrated striking performance from Robert in my opinion, while Paulo Costa remained MIA. Later that year in August, Paulo Costa was set to face Jared Cannonier, but pulled out this time due to contractual and financial reasons, taking to social media saying things like, UFC needs to pay me as main fighter to have fighting in main events. YouTubers are showing all disgrace on this business, which I'm pretty sure is a reference to what Jake Paul said at the time about Dana White and his call for better fighter pay and his criticisms for such low pay for fighters in his promotion. And apparently Paulo Costa never even signed the contract at the time the UFC announced the fight and was going to give Paulo less than $350,000 for this main event. And through the online grapevine, apparently this is a tactic by Dana to pressure fighters into signing contracts on his terms in fear of what the public backlash is going to be if a fighter doesn't sign or pull out. And for a lot of fans, this is exactly what they did, and many criticized this move from Paulo Costa. But surprisingly, the one person who didn't criticize Paulo for this move was Jared Cannonier himself, saying he understands the argument and can't hate him or knock him or chastise him for that stance. And ironically, Kelvin again stepped up for Paulo Costa and again had a banger of a fight with Jared Cannonier this time, but again ended up losing. Still, in the same year of 2021, Paulo Costa was now set to face Marvin Vettori, and this time didn't pull out, but came in 25 pounds overweight. So yeah, he showed up this time just a tad bit overweight. So with Paulo Costa coming in massive, they agreed to instead make this fight at light heavyweight or 205, and despite coming in heavier and Marvin having to make an adjustment due to Paulo Costa still lost this fight in 5 as Marvin absorbed practically every one of Paulo Costa's strikes and kept walking forward to get the decision. We would have to wait another year until Paulo Costa would return to the octagon, and this time he would face an aging Luke Rockhold originally scheduled for UFC 277, but for some unknown reason, Paulo would delay this fight to the next major UFC event at UFC 278, again showing the unreliability of this guy. But thankfully, he would actually show up to UFC 278 and had a memorable fight and send-off for Luke Rockhold, who fought with everything left in his last fight in a loss to Paulo Costa. Onward, in the beginning of this year, Paulo Costa was again scheduled to fight Robert Whittaker, but again pulled out to the fight due to contractual disputes with the UFC, and again claimed that he never signed the contract despite the UFC already promoting the fight. Apparently, this was the last fight on Paulo Costa's contract at the time, and this fight with Robert Whittaker was supposed to kick off a new contract, but negotiations fell through and led to the fight falling through as well. Josh Emmett and Yair Rodriguez ended up replacing them as the co-main event to UFC 284 and the first Volk and Islam fight, which unfortunately meant again that we wouldn't see Robert Whittaker and Paulo Costa fight in the foreseeable future. The next attempt at a Paulo Costa fight was when he was set to face Ikram Aliskerov, for UFC 291, but was called off due to Paulo Costa being rumored to be rebooked for a bigger fight later in the year, which we would come to find out was Khamzat Chimaev a couple months later for UFC 294. Ikram as well would be rebooked for UFC 294 against Warlley Alves, where he would win via nasty flying knee and TKO. As for Paulo Costa, he was again set to face Khamzat for a huge and exciting co-main event with animosity and history behind this fight from their past encounter at the UFC PI. But as per usual, Paulo Costa found a way to ruin this one too. Ahead of UFC 294, we got the unfortunate news literally weeks before the event that Paulo had an infection in his elbow that required surgery. Originally, Paulo Costa insisted that he would still fight Khamzat despite the injury, but it was then revealed a couple of days later that he would officially be pulling out of this fight and Kamaru Usman would be taking his place under short notice, which adds another disappointing result to Paulo's track record. Which brings us into today. Paulo Costa is set to face Robert Whittaker for a third time, this time at UFC 298 in February, and given his history, it's impossible to predict whether or not this fight is actually going to follow through. As we've seen in the past, Paulo Costa, since his fight with Israel Adesanya, has never actually followed through with a fight that has been scheduled for him. Literally every fight he has been scheduled, he has either come in extremely overweight, delayed the fight, or in most cases, pulled out of the fight entirely for various reasons, including injuries, sickness, or simply contractual negotiations. Paulo Costa is consistently the most inconsistent fighter when it comes to the fights that he's scheduled for and has often ruined great events, which is very unfortunate considering that he is super exciting on the mic. And when he does show up for his fights, he usually does bring it win or lose and is one of the most exciting fighters both inside and outside the cage. But his reputation amongst fans has been tarnished, and rightfully so considering how many times he has ruined great events. And talking about the frequency of how often Paulo Costa pulls out of fights also brings up the question of how he hasn't been cut from the UFC. I would imagine from Dana's perspective that Paulo Costa is the worst fighter to work with, considering all of his silly contractual negotiations and the millions of reasons to why he has to pull out or make short notice changes to pretty big main events. We've seen in the past that Dana is very quick to cut fighters or not re-sign fighters due to contractual disagreements with the UFC. And historically, Dana makes fights on his terms and does not like when fighters push back, so it's amazing that Paulo is still on the roster fighting contenders and is still offered big fights like Khamzat and Robert Whittaker given his very volatile history. But maybe in the probably likely scenario that Paulo Costa pulls out of this Robert Whittaker fight for a third time, we may see Dana White actually pull the plug on Paulo Costa, considering that he's been scheduled 8 times and has only actually fought twice in that time span. But I hope Paulo Costa can somehow figure it out, because he is one of the most entertaining, if not the most entertaining fighter on social media, and his Twitter is amazing. And he does bring that same energy into interviews and press conferences and actually does bang in fights. So again, hopefully Paulo Costa can figure it out and start fighting and being active again in the middleweight division. Anyways, what do you guys think about Paulo Costa? Is he going to pull out with this fight against Robert Whittaker? I really hope not, but is he even going to stay in the UFC if he does? And as a fan, do you still want to see Paulo Costa fight? Because personally, like I said before, I do, because he brings so much entertainment into a very already entertaining division in the middleweight division. So again, thank you guys for watching and always supporting. I'll see you guys next week. Peace.